So I was having lunch by myself at the Taco Macase in Puyol in Mexico City.
And I had a table for one. And at this restaurant for dessert and coffees, they usually send you to the terrace.
Yeah, I was already there with three people I met at the Omakase lunch, and I saw you walking by.
Exactly. So I came outside, and one of these people asked me to join them.
Yeah,
And since I was alone, I sat down.
yeah, we had coffee, dessert.
Then these people left, and we carry on chatting. Coffees became cocktails.
Yeah, and the afternoon went by. I had booked a dinner at a different restaurant, and I asked you to join me for dinner. I was going with another friend.
Exactly. So we spent like 5 hours at Pujoy.
Yeah, and it was funny because when you went to the bathroom, my friend told me, "Hey, you gotta marry this girl," and I'm like, "I just met her."
And 2 years later, we did. We got married.
What'd you say? Heard. I got that, don't worry.
Okay.
Heard, chef, got 20 chicken all day.
I love the restaurant world. I love how it creates spaces for people to come together. And like the couple you just heard there, places where we can meet the love of our life. I'm Ryan King, and I've been writing about the world of chefs and restaurants for 15 years now. But this is a world of two halves. On one side, you've got those diners who enjoy those special moments in these beautiful places. And on the other, there's this world that many of us don't even think about when we go out for a meal. The world that exists behind the kitchen doors. This is a podcast about that world. And in my time of writing about the restaurant industry, I keep hearing chefs repeat one important word over and over again.
This year is all about building the actual restaurant group's culture.
When I went to the more fine dining restaurant, it was really a toxic culture.
It comes down to culture first. Culture.
Coming up, you're going to get a deep dive into that kitchen culture. How media plays a large role in defining that culture for everyone. And you'll discover how those two things can have a major impact on your working life in kitchens. This is Heard, the podcast that aims to put the rest in restaurants.
I actually grew up in restaurants.
Ellen Meiser is a sociologist at the University of Hawaii. She's been studying people who work in hospitality, and she's had a bit of a head start in that because she's steeped in the culture herself.
I was going to go to culinary school and be the next Anthony Bourdain. It was kind of my dream, and so it was kind of a natural thing for me to want to go in and study the people that I basically bullshitted with for over 10 years.
Ellen's written a book called Making It, which is all about how people in hospitality see success and failure. When speaking to chefs for that book, she accidentally uncovered many examples of what can only be described as toxic culture in restaurants. Bad habits that have been normalized in this industry.
He said, we weren't trying to be abusive. We were just having fun. We were just letting off a little bit of steam.
Ellen's going to tell you all about what she discovered and why she thinks the media is a player in all of this. And you'll hear from industry leaders and experts from outside the culinary world who have some great ideas on how to change things.
If you can be a disciplined person, but if you can also be kind and loving, that's a good chef.
Before we get into Ellen Meiser's research, let's get a little definition on what we mean by culture in this episode. I'm talking about a set of shared beliefs, shared values and practices that define a group of people. Now, I come at this from the perspective of food journalist and diner, and I have my own little theory on this that I often repeat. The table is the stage of life. And I'll leave it to Ellen from here, the sociologist, to explain exactly what I mean when I keep saying that line.
Food is a reflection of society. What we order and how we eat and how we act in restaurants is such a way for us to perform our identities and perform our class standing. If you were to go to a really nice restaurant and ask for jalapeno poppers, that says something about you, and people automatically know, okay, oh, Ellen is one of those, right? She doesn't know. Or maybe she comes from a certain background. Eating and dining is performance, and restaurants are the stage for those performances. And I think that's really important to understand why they're such significant places.
It's interesting what you say about that performative aspect of dining in restaurant. I had to learn that myself because I come from a lower demographic in the north of England. I get thrown into this world of fine dining. I still remember the first time going to a Michelin star restaurant. It was per se, so right at the top of the chain, and having to go outside and ring my dad and be like, what do I do here? Because there's all sorts of stuff happening at this table. I don't know what to touch. And he just said to me, start from the outside in, don't touch anything until someone else has touched it before you. And I still follow those rules, and there's an etiquette, there's a way of speaking. I've never really thought about it, but when you said it, I've had to learn that performance myself.
Oh, yeah. One of the things that is really interesting is there's a paradox between people who dine versus people who make the food that they're dining on, right? There's a pace and a form to the way that you have to dine when you're out and about. And restaurants know this, right? They know how to pace meals. The paradox is that the kitchen crew eats with no form whatsoever, right? Sometimes they don't eat at all.
I got obsessed a few years ago with this picture of a chef eating over a bucket.
Oh, yeah.
If you saw that, it went quite viral. It was quite a big topic. I actually know the chef who took that picture, who was actually taking it as like a badge of honor. Like, here's one of my guys between the downtime, quickly eating so he can move on to the next part of service. And you had this guy like blue glove on, sat on a bucket, eating a sandwich. And for me, there was just this weird disconnect there of like, how is he eating like that? And so many comments of like, usually I wolf down a pickle in the cooling room. You know, I go to the fridge and I quickly snack down on some scraps. And then having spoke about this, having presented about this image and why I don't think that's a good image to sort of exemplify the industry of all these great, creative, passionate people, the chef got back in touch with me and was like, you need to see this. And someone had actually got that image tattooed on their arm. So the image of this chef sitting on a bucket eating this sandwich, he'd identified so much with that image, he'd gone off and got a full sleeve tattoo of it on his arm.
We would call that romanticization or the glorification of really toiling. Sometimes kitchen labor is also called extreme labor or extreme culture because it really demands, or at least it pushes people to be expected to behave in those ways where we were like, no, you should just go take a seat, take 5 minutes. Like these normal standards that we have in everyday workplaces, they go out the door because there's this culture of just working yourself to the bone and eating only when you have time to eat, and maybe you don't even eat at all. And so when you get a tattoo, it's really romanticizing it in a way. It's celebrating. Yeah, I'm a badass cook and I put up with it. I endure.
So what? I've been speaking to Ellen for like 2 minutes, and already we've started to dive into the tougher aspects of kitchen culture. And this idea that she keeps talking about of romanticizing the toughness of the kitchen is really important in all of this. And you'll hear why coming up. You're also going to hear some crazy stats about the amount of chefs that Ellen spoke to during her research, who talked about not only that toughness, but the toxic behavior and violence in kitchens too.
Certainly, I saw a lot of physical and verbal abuse.
Kenji López is a chef and one of the world's best food writers, and he's got a lot to say about this subject.
I think restaurant culture has changed for the better a lot in the last 20 years, but in the early 2000s, physical, mental, it was not a fun place to work. I mean, at one restaurant I was staging at, I saw one of the cooks who was on the seafood station pass a saute pan with a scallop that he had been cooking in brown butter to the chef, who sliced it open to plate it and saw that it was slightly undercooked. He picked up the scallop in his hand, like threw it at the cook's face, and then took the entire pan of hot brown butter, threw the whole pan back across the kitchen. So scalding hot brown butter flew at the cooks, splashed on their arms, splashed on their coats. Like the pan went clattering, like a raging hot pan went clattering through the kitchen. Like that kind of stuff. That was probably the most violent incident I saw. I guess I've also seen people do things like a chef reaches into a hot oven to grab a pan out and another cook will intentionally slam the oven door shut on their arm to burn them. Or I've seen cooks do things like They won't tell another cook that they left a pan on the burner or left a spoon or something on the burner so that they'll pick it up and burn themselves. Stuff like that.
Most people in most industries, if they had an experience like that, it'd be a trip straight to HR, right? Let's just take a moment to reflect on what you've heard so far. Culture is hugely important to people in the culinary world. It's something they think about a lot. But it's also an industry where people romanticize this hard work to an extent that they'll get a tattoo of a chef who can't even take a moment to sit down and eat his lunch properly. Kenji's just told you about clear physical violence in the kitchen too. And whilst he says that things are getting better in that respect, the picture that's building up here is of a culture that's really not that healthy. And the thing that gets me so confused about this subject is that when I speak to chefs about some of these really extreme aspects of kitchen culture, they kind of talk about it with this weird sense of longing, this reminiscence, the camaraderie that they remember, this romanticization that Ellen talked about before. I've lost count of the amount of times and the amount of chefs I speak to who bring up how hard the kitchen can be with this pained look on their face, but then, in the same heartbeat, they get this kind of wistful look about the relationships that they forged inside these really tough environments. Relationships forged in the heat of battle. And I use that word deliberately because one of the big themes in kitchen culture that I often hear about is that this industry is like being in the army.
Modern restaurant culture is based in the French military system, right? And there is this sort of general idea that when you are in command, other people do what you say without question.
There's the head guy, the general, the executive chef. Then there's the lieutenants, sous chefs. You have the sergeants, the junior sous chef. And then you got the foot soldiers, which are the line cooks.
It's sort of like going to war, but without fearing that you're going to die.
And this comparison, it's ingrained in kitchen culture. That this industry with its tough, high-pressured environments, it's like going into battle every evening. And yet some chefs still romanticize that environment, partly because of the bonds that they formed there with colleagues. It's a real us against the world mentality. And according to Ellen, our sociologist from Hawaii, there's a reason why that happens.
Research has found that if you are trying to gain entry into a group or into a community, they found that if when you gain entry, it's incredibly tough. They make it really hard for you to get the credential to go in, or they make it really hard for you to become one of the people, one of the guys in the kitchen. They actually find that person then has more buy-in into the group and then into that culture. And then the other thing is like this militaristic kind of vibes with the brigade system and whatnot. One of the interesting things that I found out when I was researching is that when Escoffier came up with the brigade system, it was actually not based off of the military. It was actually based off breaking down factory work. So breaking down one big task into small tasks. He just called it a brigade system. But I think that since we associate that with military, language deeply shapes how we perceive things. And then again, what is appropriate in that environment. When you have a lot of, we're going into war, let's buck up everybody, the general is calling the shots. The tickets are coming in and we got to conquer it. The ticket machine is clicking at you and it's chaos. You have your troop and you're trying to win for the night. So that can be thought of as another source of kind of normalizing that violence or normalizing that abusive feeling.
I was really surprised when Ellen told me that Escoffier's brigade system isn't in fact based on the military at all. There's this incorrect assumption across the whole food world that that's what it's all about. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Ellen talks about how important language is when it comes to establishing a culture. Even though Escoffier took this inspiration from factory work, the use of the word brigade, that important military word brigade, has this huge impact on kitchen culture. So you've got this environment, this highly romanticized environment, where people value this toil and the toughness. But when you work in that place every day, it can mean that toxic behavior, where it does exist, can start to seem quite normal. So normal, in fact, that Ellen, when she first came across stories of violence in the kitchen, she didn't even notice it herself. Someone who wasn't in the industry at all had to point it out for her.
Chef?
Heard.
Heard.
A few years ago, Ellen released a study into the impact of food media on violence inside kitchens. And that all came about because while she was researching this book, the people she interviewed kept telling her about these quite extreme experiences they'd had in their careers.
I was really interested in understanding how people who work in creative industries perceive and conceive of like success. It wasn't until I was talking to my advisor and he said, "Oh, this violence stuff, this is really interesting." And I said, "Why is that interesting?" And he said, "There's no other industry that's like this." And so it wasn't until that moment where I realized that it's not normal. It was at that moment where I was like, okay, I should probably actually pay attention to this. And when I went and I analyzed the data, I found that a vast number, I think it was, I would have to say between 30 and 40 out of 50 people talked about experiencing or meeting out violence themselves to me. So it wasn't until my professor was like, you should think about that.
That's crazy, right? No, Ellen, who's this sociologist, didn't notice the violence at all. And that's because her own background, her own training was in kitchens. It had been normalized for her. Ellen spoke to kitchen workers all over the United States, from California to New York, Florida, Arizona, and Alaska, everyone from prep cooks all the way up to chefs. She also cooked in a restaurant over a summer and wrote down her observations. She wasn't asking people about violence in kitchens. She wasn't even looking for that. But this particular topic, this negative aspect of kitchen culture, kept popping up.
When I asked them, okay, what do you think of as a failed chef or an average chef? Discussions of abuse and violence came up, and it was from them. But of course, once they started talking about it, then I'd ask them questions and I'd say, oh, yeah. Like, I had a chef who also threw something at me. And then, once they know that you've also experienced it, then people open up. I didn't ask them for this. They offered it themselves. And that's one of the reasons why I say, okay, this is important.
You spoke to 50 chefs for this paper. What stories really stuck out for you?
Yeah, I had a chef in New York. He was an older guy, really nice and very open with me. And he talked about why he engaged himself and his crew in what I would call, and I think most people would call, physical abuse and sexual abuse of his lower level employees, so his dishwashers in particular. He would tell me all of these different stories about pranking the dishwasher's genitals with ice water, like these really insane things. And he's giggling about it, and because he's remembering the past and all of these good times when he was younger. And he said, we weren't trying to be abusive. We were just having fun. We were just letting off a little bit of steam. He didn't feel like it was wrong at all, even as he looked back on it. So that was one that really stuck out to me, because I feel like that sentiment of giggling about what happened in the past, all of the bad behavior in the past, it was like personified in that guy's story and how he enjoyed thinking about it. So that one stuck with me. It was like this guy just reminiscing and having fun.
So how did Ellen go from this to writing about food media and kitchens? Well, for her, it's all about that normalization process that she had experienced herself. In other words, it's about how you react to violent or abusive behavior if you experience it at work. And Ellen says that food media has a lot to answer for in that respect.
When it comes to media in particular, what I found was that it's not a causal relationship of, okay, there's violent portrayals of chefs on TV or on film, and that causes violent behavior. It's not that. What I do argue, though, is that when you have really frequent media portrayals of violent people in kitchens, what it actually does is it primes people who are not yet in the industry, who are watching it. And a lot of times media is really the first encounter we have with a possible setting or profession, right? Oh, I want to be a lawyer. I'm going to watch Legally Blonde and get a gist of it. So this is the same thing that's happening with people who are interested in going into restaurants. They watch House Kitchen. They read Anthony Bourdain books. And what it does is it primes them so that when they then enter into the workforce, it's not weird to them. It doesn't feel off to them. It doesn't seem wrong when somebody shoves past them. It makes it feel normal. It means that it isn't something that you have to call out, because why would you call out something that is normal? And that's why violence features so prominently in kitchen work and in most countries. If we're just talking about it in the West, there's been tons of research done by people all over Europe, Australia, the US that shows that this is really a constant pattern of behavior that we find in kitchens.
And whilst Ellen says that food media isn't directly to blame for violence in kitchens, she certainly thinks that it's had an impact on how people feel about that violence, if and when they do experience it. Kenji Lopez's experience as a chef do seem to back that hypothesis up. And Kenji's been calling out abusive behavior on screen for quite some time now. He's also pretty open and honest about the fact that he could have easily gone that way himself.
There was a point in my career where I was heavily influenced by people like Gordon Ramsay, by people like Anthony Bourdain, at least earlier Anthony Bourdain's work. And I was sort of brought up in these kind of toxic kitchens. And I think there was a point in my career where if I just kept going, I could have very easily ended up perpetuating this cycle. I could see myself going down that route. Like I could see myself feeling, okay, like, oh, I went through this business. It's like the whole idea that getting abuse is kind of a rite of passage. Like it's a hazing thing where you endure it and now you get to dole it out to like the newcomers. And it's just part of the thing that makes you feel like you're part of a team. In a way, it's this psychological thing where once you go through it, you feel, oh yeah, that's the thing that made me. That abuse is what made me who I am. So I'm grateful for the abuse. Like it's done good for my life. That's why it's okay. And to be able to realize, no, like that's not true. Like that's not what made you good. Like you're good despite the abuse. Like the abuse is not what made you good. To be able to come to that realization, I think is a difficult step. And it was a difficult step for me.
Kenji might have found this very difficult, but he's done a lot more than recognizing he's good despite the abuse. He's written about the toxic nature of kitchens and how those kitchens get represented in food media. And a few years ago, he wrote a post that went crazy viral about one TV chef in particular.
In my career as a cook, it's not uncommon for me to hear young line cooks speak about Gordon Ramsay, specifically about his behavior, about how you have to be tough in the kitchen, about the way he behaves on his TV shows, especially his older TV shows where he's yelling and he's acting like a chef from the early 2000s. But more than once in my career, frequently I hear people cite him as an inspiration, and I see this get translated to poor behavior in real life. Not necessarily even just abusive behavior, but the normalization of abusive behavior and the being okay with abusive behavior, the thinking that this abuse is okay because it's what's going to produce results. This is what you need to do in order to get the food of the quality that is going to get you however many Michelin stars Ramsay has. And what I frequently see online is people defending him saying, oh, well, it's just an act. It doesn't matter that it's just an act, because the fact is that the people who follow him and who follow his behavior and use his behavior as an example are looking at that act and are following that act.
And Ellen's study picked up on this too. Gordon Ramsay and Anthony Bourdain were mentioned many times while she was interviewing people for this research.
Those two names were the ones that came up voluntarily from interviewees. Gordon Ramsay in particular was an example of somebody who people called both an example of a bad chef, but also an example of a very successful chef, which I think he does. He runs the gamut. I also had, interestingly, a couple interviewees who worked for him behind the scenes on his shows, and they loved him. He's a workhorse. He's wonderful. He's really polite. He's very nice to be around. It's just as soon as those TV cameras come on that he puts on this persona, right? And so the reason why he is featured so prominently is A, because of the frequency of mention, but also B, the way that people internalized the Gordon Ramsays of the kitchen, right? I have a quote in my article from a girl who she would watch Food Network and she would watch Hell's Kitchen. And she said before she even went into her first kitchen job, she imagined she was either going to be working with Ina Garten, the wonderful, nice 60-year-old woman who has goblets of wine all the time, or she was going to be working for Gordon Ramsay. In her mind, that was what she was expecting. And she said, yeah, I ended up working for a lot of Gordon Ramsays. And she chuckled about it. These images of chefs that we get from media, again, they prime us. They tell us what to expect in behavior. So she ended up expecting to be abused so that when it happened to her, she didn't blink an eye because that's what Gordon Ramsay does. That's just what they do. And so it happened to her and it's normal. right? There's nothing to change about it because why do you have to change something that's normal?
Bourdain seemed to come up an awful lot as well. And he is seen as like almost this demigod in the industry, no? This like the leader of the gang type of thing.
Bourdain is a huge figure, but I would say, unlike Gordon Ramsay, Bourdain was seen as somebody who was like a conductor of kitchen culture and a journalist of kitchen culture. Like, he was seen in a far more kind of artistic, creative way. But I still think he plays into this romanticization of violent kitchens and of abusive behavior. His first book is filled with that stuff.
I'm going to level with you. I am on a mission to get you to talk to someone. Because as we've already established, this industry is tough. Remember, if you need some help, there's a great 501c3 that offers free mental health support for those working in the US restaurant industry. They're called Southern Smoke, and you can reach them at southernsmoke.org. Listen, we've spoke a lot about this toxic environments and toxic behavior, but it's not all like this. I know that there are plenty of leaders within this industry who run positive, inspiring kitchens, great places to work. And I think taking inspiration from those positive leaders can be a clear way out of all this. Herd is all about trying to tackle some of these toxic aspects of the culture. And I've been doing that by speaking to experts from a number of other industries, just to see what we can learn from them. I've been asking a lot about leadership, and the interesting thing is that when I do talk to experts, like the elite performance coach Dr. Julie Gerner, they often say that when it comes to leadership, it's really important that people look within their own industry for examples.
I want to understand what being a great leader as a chef really does look like through their eyes and their experience. I think the first thing I would do is I would ask them, the best people that they have worked with, tell me a little bit about the things you loved about working with them. And then usually people will also say, yeah, and as much as I learned under their mentorship, there was also they did this really terrible thing that was very maybe abusive, and that's the thing that you would cut out. But there are good things that we want to keep. And if they're a fantastic chef, they probably have a number of examples of the things that really create strong, solid, healthy leadership that they have appreciated, that has stuck with them through the years. And then I would probably surface what those things represent. There's usually things at the bottom of these, like really good communication. They understand team dynamics. And then the things that are toxic, there's usually a few notches down where you could just be demanding, but not toxic. Because I think that we have to be realistic that good leadership is also demanding.
There's a lot more on this in Dr. Julie's episode of Herd, and from what she's saying here, it is possible to learn from some leaders, even if they're not perfect all the time. Dr. Julie's thoughts on asking the people in the industry what they think about this, well, that's also really important to Ellen Meiser too.
It would be interesting as you're talking to people, especially chefs in the industry and cooks themselves. It would be cool to see what they think should actually be done that would actually be practical and effective to change this behavior, right? Because a lot of the times it's people who are politicians or policymakers or nonprofits. It's just totally impractical policymaking. Or people like me, I've been out of the industry for several years now, who are coming up with these recommendations, and we're not the ones who are living it. So we come up with these window dressing, high flatten ideas that really are not practical and not going to achieve anything. So I think it'd be interesting if you're talking to people in kitchens to see what actually will work, right?
I'm a huge fan of trying to get inspiration from the culinary community on this. And that's kind of what Herd is all about. But the big question I'm tussling with right now, though, is how can you recognize great leadership? That type of leadership that could help change this industry, especially if toxic behavior has become so normalized, like Ellen says. You can't be what you can't see. So one of the things that Herd is trying to do is highlight examples of good leadership. Let's start talking about what makes a great leader and break it down so we really can understand what works. Sports psychologist Dr. Tom Ferrero is another expert I've spoken to for this series. Let's get his thoughts on this.
what's a good leader? I once did a documentary film about Little League Baseball, about this one coach that was a super coach, and they won the Little League World Series. So I wound up talking a lot about leadership. And what I wound up saying about that coach was that he was disciplinarian, but at the same time, he was loving and he educated people. But that's a number of antagonistic dynamics, right? Tough guy, loving guy. Those elements make up a good coach, which is similar to being a boss, right? If you can educate the staff to learn more about how to cook, if you can be a disciplined person, but if you can also be kind and loving, that's a good chef.
It's becoming so obvious now that we need to ask more chefs what they think about this. The last episode of Herd Season 1, we're going to do just that. We're going to bring a group of chefs together and have a debate and put these questions of leadership, of media, of healthcare, all of these topics we've discussed across this season. And we're going to find out what they think about all of this. But listening to Dr. Tom, it reminded me of a story that Chef Harold Villarosa told me about the moment he fell in love with this industry. And for me, it's everything that Dr. Tom has just said in action.
One of the best memories as a chef was at this restaurant called Fedora in the West Village. The chef that was there, his name was Mehdi Brinkley. He was a chef de cuisine at Au Pied de Cochon in Montreal for about 12 years. I didn't really recognize who he was until I started working with him. And one day, it was like right after service, he was like, yo, what you doing tomorrow? I said, I'm just hanging out at the house until I come to work. He was like, why don't you come early? Like, come at like 9. I said, okay, yeah, let's do that. So I come at 9, and he had maybe 16 beautiful quails from a farm in Pennsylvania. He's like, did you ever learn how to break down quail? I was like, no, I never learned how to debone a whole quail before. He's like, all right, so we're going to make quail Ballantine today with this foie gras chanterelle farce. We're going to serve it with some orchetti pasta we're making in-house with some sauce, like a brown butter chicken sauce, whatever. So, all right, cool. So, like, oh, before all that, let's go smoke a cigarette and drink espresso. So we're in the backyard of the restaurant. We're drinking, espresso and smoking cigarettes, just catching up. And he's just there asking me about my career, what I want to learn, and all this kind of stuff. And then we get to work, and he just shows me like the first cuts, how to open the quail from the back, scraping on the joints, and all that kind of stuff. At that moment, I realized I fucking love nose to tail cooking. Like, and then from that then on, I became the guy that would just come in and not even clock in and just be like, he let me do all of it.
Seemed like good leadership as well.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And I feel like I really needed to hear that story there, especially after all this talk of toxicity in kitchens. Listen, when it comes to leadership, I'm not all airy-fairy, kumbaya, sit around the fire, hearts and rainbows. You can be demanding and still expect high standards. What I'm talking about is making sure that as a disciplined leader, you don't lean over into becoming a toxic one, because the line is thin. You could say that an example of leadership is to actually call out toxic behavior, which is something that Kenji López has been doing for years now. But sometimes when you start to question the status quo, it kind of doesn't go down very well.
The strongest reactions will come from the Reddit community. So there's like Chef It and Kitchen Confidential are the sort of two chef-oriented Reddit communities, and they tend to have the strongest reactions. And what I found over the years, because I've been talking about Ramsay for, I don't know, at least 15 years or so, 10, 15 years, if not longer. I don't know, a long time. But I found over the years that the reaction has changed for the better, that it used to be that when you went to like the Kitchen Confidentials, that people would just say, oh, like Kenji, he's just a pussy. He's soft. Like he's only complaining because he quit restaurants because he couldn't handle the heat and he wasn't good enough. Very typical nonsense, but also very expected sort of behavior from, abuse victims, people who have gone through sort of hazing and have come out the other side as either supporters of abusers or, either complicit or participants themselves. These days, when this stuff comes up, it's almost always people being like, yeah, like I'm glad I don't work in kitchens like that. You might see comments now and then being like, oh, you guys are all soft, and those just get downvoted. I do think there's a general shift in the culture and sort of the thinking about this, which has been really heartening to see.
Well, that's where the change will come from, no?
The next generation, for sure.
It's great to hear that the next generation of chefs are starting to break some of these cycles. And Ellen's paper has had wide attention from the industry too.
I've probably had 5 different organizations reach out to me separately after reading this paper and some of the other stuff that I've written, who are in the US, in Canada, 2 organizations in Canada, who are trying to decrease the amount of violence in kitchens, to get rid of abuse and to make it no longer the norm. And so I do see that happening, some sort of organizing happening. I think people are a lot more worried about getting called out about bad behavior and about getting sued for bad behavior. And that is perhaps probably going to be more effective in changing behaviors, is the worry about getting canceled and by the public or getting sued. That's a horrible thing to say. That's the only reason why we change our behaviors.
I think there's an economical factor as well, which is
Yeah.
lots of people left the industry during COVID, never to return. Retention rates are very low. Hiring is very difficult. It costs a lot of money. You've then got to train, and there's transient nature. So you train, and often these people then go somewhere else for $2 more.
Yeah.
I think often economical factors will drive change faster than ethical factors, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a capitalist world, right? Money talks, and money can push you into certain places, and it can push you to do certain things and not do certain things. A lot of people, of course, continue to see COVID, but a lot of people in the height of COVID really thought that was going to change the industry. I mean, David Chang famously was interviewed on the New York Times and said something about this is the moment of change for the industry and all of those things. I don't know if that's really happened. I don't think so in terms of whether or not behavior's gotten better. If it has, I think it's more likely due to what you just mentioned, which is it's harder to find people who are going to work in restaurants. And so people realize, okay, I got to treat you better. But, if we just look at food media, if we wanted to gauge things based off of food media, the past handful of famous chef anythings has been The Bear, The Menu. These are all chefs who are either homicidal. Ralph Fiennes did amazing. I love that movie. I thought it was great. The Bear, I watch it and I get anxiety just watching it. Clearly, this trope of the passionate, crazy, angry, violent chef, it persists.
I have The Bear here as one of my questions because everyone keeps mentioning it. Chefs keep saying it gives them PTSD.
Yeah.
But often when chefs mention it, they say, oh, this is the first real look at the kitchen. This is honest. This is true.
I tried to get through a few episodes and I was like, ugh, I'm not in kitchens for a reason right now. I don't need to go back. I don't need to feel this.
So is that the example of food media doing the right thing rather than romanticizing the violence?
It's a great show. It clearly gets me going, right? So even if the story itself does not show aggression in a nice light or makes it seem appealing, the way other forms of media, in terms of news media or award shows, can take it and they can twist it and say, but Jeremy Allen White was so sexy when he was doing that, right? Oh my gosh, now he's the Calvin Klein underwear model. Look at him, right? That, in a way, can still act as this process of romanticization and glorification of the aggressive chef. It doesn't just come in that form of what's on the screen. It also includes how that image on the screen is interpreted by your audience, right?
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here, but it's only because I'm expecting resistance. A lot of my audience are chefs, and whenever you try to point change out and much needed change, you're faced with resistance. I'm very much used to that. I'm expecting them to argue back that kitchens have always been this way, even before we had food media. What do you think of that idea, that argument? How would you rebut that argument?
I would agree that this culture of abuse and aggression and violence has been in kitchens since the dawn of Escoffier. Escoffier famously says in his memoir that he was raised by a chef who showered him with a shower of slaps, was how he was trained, right? He just got slapped a bunch, and that's how he became a good chef. So I do not think that food media is the cause of violence in kitchens. Not at all. What I think it does, though, is it magnifies it, it glorifies it, It puts it on screens for people who are not yet in kitchens to watch, to consume, to think about, to imagine. And so in that way, media does play a role, but it wasn't the catalyst, not by any measure.
But what about other programs, other companies? Are there any other organizations that can help with this? Ellen definitely thinks that more could be done on this topic.
Unions are more in fashion now than they have been in the past couple decades over here. What would be kind of interesting is to lodge that question to somebody at the American Chef Federation, which is supposedly like the largest chef org here in the United States, because they don't put out anything about any of this stuff. They're almost apolitical. So what is the purpose of the country's largest chef organization if they're not really organizing, would be what you could pose to them.
We approached Gordon Ramsay to put Kenji's comments and Ellen's research directly to him. At the time of publishing this episode, we still haven't heard back. Gordon, I'd love to speak to you if you want, so get in touch. We also approached the American Culinary Federation to respond to the specific question that Ellen just mentioned. I'll update you on that as and when we get a reply. But after all the research that Ellen has done on this and the sheer amount of times that she's heard Mr. Ramsay's name, I couldn't resist asking her if she wanted to ask him just one question. What would that question be?
Oh, gosh. Because a good amount of people who I interviewed actually worked with him and said that he was really a lovely guy, I would ask him right before the cameras turn on, what do you think that gets you into the mind frame of TV Gordon Ramsay? Because that must be an interesting transition to go through. Like, how do you switch from being a really wonderful workhorse that everybody loves into putting two pieces of toast on somebody's face and calling them a idiot sandwich?
I think he probably thinks of Marco Pierre White giving him abuse. There's a clip where some journalist asked Marco, because Ramsay's mum has sort of said that he used to come home crying after shifts there.
Oh.
And so some journalist says to Marco, why did you make Gordon cry when he was working for you in the kitchen? He said, I never made him cry. Gordon chose to cry himself. Sad example of the cycle of toxic behavior. And there's lots that can be taken from what Ellen and Kenji and the raft of chefs we've spoken to and all of these experts have to say on these topics. Firstly, you can still take inspiration from leaders who sometimes behave badly. Take the good bits along with you. Secondly, there's no denying that great leaders are tough, but they're also loving. Leadership involves education. Teach your crews. It shows them that you have their best interests at heart, that you want them to progress. And progression, that feeling of moving and learning in a job, is something that retains everyone in a crew. Our performance coach, Dr. Julie Gerner, talks about great communication and how important it is to have an understanding of team dynamics. Do you have a hidden leader within your crew? Lots of food for thought here. Remember, if you've been troubled by anything that you've heard in this series, then check out Southern Smoke, an amazing 501c3 that offers free mental health sessions for anyone working in the US restaurant industry. Just visit southernsmoke.org to get more details. Next time on Heard, Ben Shrewy from Attica in Melbourne talks leadership, mental health, how to build great restaurant culture, and a host of other topics, including a very powerful message to the legacy of Anthony Bourdain.
Parts of Kitchen Confidential, if you read sections of the book now, it's unmistakably misogynistic. And I hear generations of young men, and men of all ages, frankly, worshipping the book. The book is not the man, and we all evolve as humans, but the book still exists and it sold well over 1 million copies, Ryan. So it's a significant influence in our culture, and I think it offers significant validation for young men or men of any age who have the wrong thinking, who are looking for it.
You've been listening to Heard, the podcast that aims to put the rest in restaurants. This podcast was produced and hosted by me, Ryan King, and produced by the wonderful Helen Brown. You'll hear from us again in a couple of weeks when we'll bring you more insights from leaders and experts, both within and outside this amazing industry. Please remember to rate, review, and share to spread the word about Herd.